Okay, so thank you for joining tonight. The purpose of our Zoom class, which will certainly be finished by 9 o'clock tonight, is to review with all of you the laws for heating up food on Shabbos. If you have any questions about particular situations that I don't cover, so we'll have an opportunity to ask those questions at the end. If I still haven't answered your questions, then please feel free to reach out to me and we can discuss it personally and privately. So first of all, the general conditions for warming up food on Shabbos. Number one, all food has to be fully cooked. That applies to anything that you are serving for lunch to your guests. It must be fully cooked before Shabbos. The only exception to this rule is cholent. If you are serving cholent, so then the cholent that needs to be at least a third of the way cooked before Shabbos begins. It does not need to be fully cooked before Shabbos begins like the rest of the food. But anything other than cholent needs to be fully cooked before Shabbos begins. Number two, the heat source that you are using to warm up the food, and we'll go into the specifics of that, must be a covered fire, either a blech or a hot plate or a warming drawer or a warming cart. We'll look at each of those individually, but in each of them, the fire must be covered. And the third condition to remember is that when you have the food on a covered fire, on a blech or on a hot plate, the food cannot be stirred, covered or uncovered, or served from on top of that blech or hot plate. Meaning, let's say that I am serving, let's say that I have a cholent cooking in a pot, which is on top of my blech. So I can't take and spoon the cholent out from that pot while it is still on top of my blech. I have to take it off of the blech before spooning it out. That applies not only to food at lunch, but applies to any food on Shabbos, meaning if you are serving Friday night soup to your company and the soup is on the blech Friday night, you're not allowed to ladle out the soup while it is on the blech. You have to remove the soup from the blech and ladle it into the bowls, and then you could put the soup back on the blech after that. Okay, those are the general conditions for serving warm food, hot food on Shabbos. Number one, fully cooked. Number two, warmed up on an appropriate fire source. And number three, not stirred, covered, uncovered, or served while it is on that fire source. Okay. So let's first understand a couple of things. Reheating food which has been in the refrigerator. So there are two categories of food when we talk about reheating. There's solid food and there is liquid food. Actually, there's a third category, and that is food which we're not sure whether it is considered solid or liquid. We'll deal with each of these three categories separately. Let's first of all deal with solid food. What would be considered an example of solid food? So let's say you have potato kugel, right? You cook a potato kugel before Shabbos. Remember, the requirement is that all food needs to be cooked before Shabbos. So you cook your potato kugel before Shabbos and you put it in the refrigerator. Now you want to warm up that potato kugel on Shabbos. That potato kugel is a solid food. And if you're going to warm up a solid food, so following is the procedure. You take the potato kugel out of the refrigerator. You are not allowed to put the potato kugel directly on a heat source, meaning you can't put the potato kugel directly on the blech or directly on the hot plate. What you need to do is place it on something that elevates it from the surface of the blech or the hot plate. What would be an example of that? One example would be take a cookie sheet, invert the cookie sheet, turn the cookie sheet upside down, place it on the blech, and then put the potato kugel on top of that cookie sheet. What is the reason for doing that? The reason is so that if anybody walks into your kitchen and sees the potato kugel on the blech, it will be clear to them that that potato kugel is not being cooked on Shabbos, because nobody cooks on top of an inverted pan, right? If you're going to cook something, you're going to put it right directly on the heat source. You would put it directly on the blech. So here you are ensuring that nobody thinks that you are cooking that potato kugel by placing it on top of an inverted pan, or if, let's say, there's a pot on the blech already, so placing it on top of that pot. Not so relevant for lunch because nobody leaves a pot pretty much on the blech the entire night or on the hot plate the entire night, but that would be appropriate, let's say, for Friday night. Let's say that you have soup, a pot of soup, which is on the blech Friday night, and you want to warm up something from the refrigerator. You could put it on top of that pot of soup for it to get warmed up that way. If you have a pot of cholent cooking all night long on the blech and you want to heat up your potato kugel for lunch, so you could take your potato kugel out of the refrigerator and put it on top of the cholent pot, which is the same thing as putting it on top of the inverted cookie sheet. So when we talk about inverting a cookie sheet or putting it on top of a pot, we're talking about a heat source such as a blech, which is on top of your stove, or a hot plate that is capable of cooking. But if you have something which is not capable of cooking, for instance, you have a warming drawer. No one cooks in a warming drawer. Or you have a warming cart, the Vicron cart as an example. No one cooks in the Vicron cart. So since no one cooks normally in these on a hot plate that only has, let's say, one level of heat, or in a warming drawer or in a warming cart, so there's no need to invert it. The only need to invert a cookie sheet and to put it on top of the cookie sheet would be if you were doing it on a blech, which you could theoretically cook on, or you were doing it on a hot tray or a hot plate that you could theoretically cook on. To review, I take my kugel out of the refrigerator. I want to warm up my potato kugel on Shabbos. Depends on how I am warming it. If I'm warming it on my blech, which is on top of my stove, I need to invert a cookie sheet and put the potato kugel on top of the cookie sheet. Or if I have a pot there, I need to put my potato kugel on top of a pot. If I am planning on warming up my potato kugel on a warming tray that has temperature controls that I could theoretically cook with, it gets hot enough that I could cook on it. So I have to treat it like it's a stove. I have to invert a cookie sheet and put it on top of the cookie sheet. But if I am warming up my potato kugel in something which is not normally used for cooking, I'm heating up my potato kugel in a warming drawer, I'm heating up my potato kugel in a warming cart, so then I do not need to invert it. The whole purpose of inverting it is so that people see that you're not cooking. If you're warming it up in something that is not normally used for cooking, then there's no reason to invert the sheet. Thelma, you have a question? Go ahead.
What about rice?
Rice is the same as potato kugel. It is
We
a
cook it in a
solid
rice
food.
pot before Shabbos.
What?
We have it fully cooked before Shabbat in the rice pot.
So that's fine. And what do you do with the rice pot? You just leave the rice pot on the top of the blech?
Yeah.
That's not a problem. As long, what I'm talking about is taking something out of the refrigerator,
fridge, right.
Shabbos lunch, and now warming it up. You're talking about leaving something on from Friday afternoon, leaving it on the blech. That's not a problem. That's not the same thing. I'm talking about for lunch specifically, taking something out of the refrigerator and warming it up. Does that answer the question?
Lunchtime also, as another lunch, there's another pot that's already cooked. And we don't refrigerate it, but we put it onto the platter before, like 2 hours before lunch is being served.
You put the rice directly onto the platter?
From the same pot onto the, whatever it's called, the hot plate.
Is that a hot plate that's capable of cooking?
It's the normal stuff that you buy in the store. It doesn't have temperatures.
It doesn't have temperatures. If it doesn't have
No.
temperature controls, then it's like the warming cart.
Yeah,
You can't cook on it, and then you could put the pot directly on top of it without a problem.
gotcha.
But if it's a hot plate that you can cook on, then you would need to put a cookie sheet, turn a cookie sheet upside down or something like that.
What's a hot plate that you can cook on? Then it's not Shabbos stick, is it?
No, when I say a hot plate that can cook on, I mean a hot plate that is capable of being used for cooking. There are some hot plates that have controls to them.
Oh, yeah.
And they get hot enough to actually cook.
Gotcha.
Okay. Okay. So this is talking about a food which is considered a solid. What about a food which is considered a liquid, such as soup or gravy or something like that? That may not be reheated on Shabbos. There is no way to heat that up on Shabbos. No way I can take soup out of the refrigerator or gravy out of the refrigerator and heat that up on Shabbos. The only way to do that is to keep the soup on the blech the entire night, or to keep the gravy on the blech the entire night, which is difficult to do because it will probably spoil, or else to use a crock pot to keep the soup or the gravy hot all night long. You can cook it and keep it in a crock pot all night long and then use it for lunch on Shabbos. But short of that, you can't take a cold liquid and reheat that cold liquid on Shabbos. A cold solid can be reheated. A cold liquid cannot be reheated. What about if you have something in this category which is a combination of solid and liquid? So for instance, if I take my chicken from Friday night and I put it in the refrigerator, in all likelihood, Shabbos, when I take it out in the morning, there's going to be a gel kind of substance on the chicken, which is the fat or the liquid from the night before that has solidified in the refrigerator. So is that, and when I warm that up, what's going to happen to it? It is going to become liquidy again. So if it is attached to the solid in such a way so that it's considered part of the solid, like this fat on the chicken that has solidified, so then I'm allowed to warm that up on Shabbos. But let's say that it's meatballs and sauce. I took meatballs and sauce. I cooked them before Shabbos, and now I put them in the refrigerator. I'm going to take my meatballs and sauce out of the refrigerator, and when I heat that up, what am I going to have when it's finished? Meatballs and sauce separately. And the sauce is going to be a liquid which is going to be hot. That I am not allowed to do on Shabbos. So heating a solid, I'm allowed to do. Heating a liquid, I'm not allowed to do. Heating a combination of solid and liquid depends on the composition. If it's like chicken and the fat which has solidified, that would be permissible. But if it's like meatballs and the sauce, that would not be permissible. Okay. Okay. So if I am using, again, let's once again look at the various possible heat sources for warming something up. I could be using a blech. What is a blech? A blech is a metal tray, piece of metal that is covering the fire, so that the fire on the stove, the burner that is that is on is covered by this metal blech. Ideally, not only should the fire be covered by the blech, but ideally the controls of the stove should be covered as well. And what I recommend, I don't recommend covering the controls of the stove with that same piece of metal, because what will happen is sometimes the knobs on the stove will become damaged as a result of the heat. I suggest taking a piece of aluminum foil and just wrapping the aluminum foil around the controls. Serves as a reminder that you're not allowed to adjust the controls on Shabbos. This should be done if you're using the blech on top of a stove, or if you are using a hot tray that is capable of cooking. If you're using a hot tray that's capable of cooking, you should cover the hot tray with a piece of aluminum foil on the top, and you should wrap the aluminum foil or a separate piece of aluminum foil around the controls. You do not need to cover anything if you are using a warming cart. If you're using a warming drawer, the generally accepted opinion is that you should cover with aluminum foil the controls of the warming drawer as a reminder to yourself that you should not adjust the controls of that warming drawer. Okay. Let's talk for a moment about making coffee and or tea on Shabbos. How does one make coffee and or tea on Shabbos? Let's start with tea. It's a little bit easier. So when one makes tea on Shabbos, there are several different ways of making the tea. The first way that one can make the tea is by using a tea bag. In other words, taking a tea bag and dipping the tea bag into the cup of hot water. In order to do that, the water needs to be classified as a kli shlishi, as a third level cup. What does that mean? So let's consider how water is kept warm on Shabbos. Generally, you have your urn. Your urn is considered a kli rishon. It is a pot that is on a fire source. With urns, there is an electric fire source, and that is heating the water. That's considered a kli rishon. If you fill up a teacup from that urn, that teacup is considered a kli sheni. It is now a second level utensil. And if I pour from that teacup into a second teacup, that second teacup becomes a kli shlishi, a third level utensil, and I can put my tea bag into that kli sheni. I can't put my tea bag into a kli shlishi, I'm sorry. I can't put my tea bag into a kli sheni or into a kli rishon because I am worried that I might be cooking the tea leaves that are in the tea bag. So if you're going to use a tea bag, if you're going to serve tea to your guests, and you're going to put tea bags on the table, so then the best way to serve the tea is to fill up a teapot from the urn. The teapot now becomes a kli sheni. And then at the table, have people fill their teacups from that teapot, making their teacups a kli shlishi, and they can then put the tea bag directly into that kli shlishi. That is one way of making tea. A second way of making tea is to use what we call tea essence. And what is that? Before Shabbos, take, let's say, a measuring cup, a Pyrex measuring cup, and fill it halfway with boiling water and put 4 or 5 tea bags into that boiling water. Tea essence is essentially very, very strong tea, concentrated tea. And now what you can do is you can take a teacup, fill it from the urn, which makes a kli sheni, and you can pour that tea essence into the teacup, into the kli sheni. You don't need a kli shlishi for tea essence. You only need a kli shlishi for a tea bag, but not for tea essence. For tea essence, it is sufficient to use a kli sheni. What about if you're serving coffee? So it depends. If you are using instant coffee, which is already cooked, so then a kli sheni is fine. Fill up a cup from the urn and put your spoonful of coffee directly into that cup. Since it's already been cooked, a kli sheni is fine. You don't need to worry about using a kli shlishi. Okay. So that's when it comes to making tea or when it comes to making coffee. Obviously, the sugar or creamer, if you are using it, should be placed into kli after you put the coffee. If it's a kli sheni, you put the coffee in the kli sheni, and then you can pour the creamer or the sugar in. And the same thing by a kli shlishi if you are using a tea bag, or a kli sheni if you are using tea essence. Okay. So that basically for us covers all of the situations that you might find yourself encountering on Shabbos. I'll take a few minutes if you have any questions.
What about Persian stews that are more solid than liquid?
Persian stews that are more solid than liquid, if they are liquidy, they should be treated as a liquid and not reheated on Shabbos. A stew should not be reheated on Shabbos. Persian stews are more like cholent, which means they need to be kept warm the entire night, not taken out of the refrigerator and reheated.
The meat. Yeah, the chickens you can't reheat. Yeah.
Correct.
Stews that are chicken you can't eat.
Okay. Any other questions? So I want to thank you for participating in 360 and for hosting. If you have any particular questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll be glad to answer them.
How about, are the rules different for Sephardim and Ashkenazim?
Some of the rules are different for Sephardim and Ashkenazim, but since you are having over generally Ashkenazim for your Shabbos meal, we ask that you follow the Ashkenazi customs. Okay? Okay, everybody, have a great evening. Thank you very much for participating.
Good night. Thank you.